Good evening, live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Welcome to this week's penultimate edition of The Watchdog. My name is Diesel Wilson, standing in for my colleague William Vogel. On tonight's show, we can expect to see some reactions coming through. The ANC says it will appeal the decision of the High Court in Johannesburg, which ordered the governing party to hand over records of its Cadre deployment committee to the Democratic Alliance. Also coming up, Cape Town's embarking 120 billion rand investment in the city's bulk infrastructure, with a particular focus on water and sanitation, including housing, energy, transport, as well as other sectors in the coming decade. On that note, the Watchdog begins. Right, so first up, the ANC says it will appeal the decision of the High Court in Johannesburg, which ordered the governing party to hand over records of its Cadre deployment committee to the Democratic Alliance. Yesterday, the court ruled that it was unlawful for the ANC to refuse to make public records dating back to 2013, when the party's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was made deployment committee chairperson. Just last week, lawyers for the DA argued that the ANC's deployment policy was unconstitutional and asked the court to declare it invalid. The main opposition is of the view that this policy is the root cause of problems in the delivery of basic services, including electricity. But the ANC said the committee's recommendations relating to public service and SOE positions were not binding on government ministers, premiers, or even mayors. All right, so for more on the story, we're joined by Angelo Fick, Director of Research at the Orwell Socio-Economic Research Institute, and Professor Vegi Mngomezulu from the University of the Western Cape. A very good evening to the both of you. Thank you for joining us here on The Watchdog.
Good evening.
Thank you for having us. And just one correction, I'm now with the Nelson Mandela University, not Western Cape anymore.
All right, thank you, Prof, for that. I will be sure to correct it. Prof, on that note, let me start with you. The DA, having claimed victory after the courts cleared way for the release of the documents related to the ANC's Cadre deployment policy. Is this a long-lived victory, especially now that the ANC says it's ultimately going to also challenge this decision?
Yeah, most definitely. It's within the ANC's right to challenge the decision. Maybe there are a couple of questions that need to be addressed. The first one is, where was the DA all along? If this process started long time ago, why all of a sudden do they have an issue with that? That is the first question for me. Then the second question is, would it not have been better for the DA to identify specific individuals and say X and Y were appointed, but they didn't have the requisite skills to perform their duties, and therefore this is what has happened, as opposed to challenging a party policy? Because then what this means is that if you challenge a party policy, then it means the same party can also do the same with you, and then this thing will go on endlessly. So these parties will end up fighting amongst themselves, as opposed to delivering services to the electorate, which is what you and I are interested in. And of course, Angelo there is also interested in service delivery, not in these squabbles between political parties. For me, this is something that is not supposed to be given first priority. And I'm surprised that the DA, in fact, saw it fit to challenge a party position in a court of law. So that's a surprise for me.
All right, Prof, thank you for those sentiments. Obviously, given how broad the scope is at this point, the timing has really come under question, as well as, specific individuals, which you've alluded to. We will unpack that a little bit later on. Angela, let me bring you into the conversation at this point and really look at how much of a role do you think Cadre deployment has played in corruption and state capture to date, given the fact that we're facing, rolling blackouts amongst many other service delivery issues? And also just, obviously, that was an argument that was put forth by the DA.
So let us not forget that the President of the Republic of South Africa appeared before the State Commission or the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture. And as President of the party, the African National Congress, the party of government at the time and still is a party of national government, defended the policy of Cadre deployment and argued, in fact, that it was not such an exceptional practice, that OECD countries did the same thing. But he did this in the process in which we were trying to uncover what had happened over a long decade decade that, predates Mr. Zuma's administration throughout both of his administrations and seems to continue into the contemporary moment. And I think partly because of Cyril Ramaphosa's statements before then Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, the opposition may have felt that it was time to clarify exactly what it is that happened there. Because let's not forget that the president of the ANC and then head of state didn't really clarify issues of cadre deployment when it was raised, and in fact defended the policy and indicated that the committee was fairly powerless and only made recommendations that weren't necessarily followed. But the query with that would be, what would have been the cost to people in the party, in their lives, in the party, and their trajectories in politics had they, opposed these cadre deployment issues? And I think there is a correlation between government policy, ANC policy for its deployees in government, and the state of corruption that we sat with for more than a decade and still sit with and have to unpack. So while I don't think the one thing causes the other as a matter of natural consequence, I think in South Africa there is a strong correlation between governing party policy and governing party performance in government.
Angela, on that note, then let's look at how the policy then came, under increased scrutiny since the Zondo Commission's considerations of the issue. And really what the policy reflected, how it became, or it was now deemed inconsistent with the Constitution, which, as we know, requires South Africa's public service to be free from political interference. I'm only asking this because one has to question also where cadre deployment begins and ends.
Absolutely. So if we look at the way in which at local government level in municipalities, people have been, moved around, particularly in ANC municipalities, and often, resigned in one municipality and applied for a job and successfully got it in a different municipality as they were facing disciplinary processes. One has to ask what their task was. And through the testimony coming out of the State Capture Commission, there were many, many questions asked and not necessarily fully answered around the role of people like Brian Molefe in state-owned enterprises. So not just at local government level, but in the SOEs. And then also when we think of national level, we're thinking of cabinet. And we're asking questions, as we have since before the State Capture Commission, about the appointment of people in the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Finance, and the consequences of that for policy making. At the same time, we had ministers in government defying not only government policy, but actually party policy. Let's not forget digital migration under then Minister of Communications. So there are a whole bunch of questions that have to be asked about the ANC's implementation of its own policy, which it defended, but also what the consequences of that were. And let's not forget the way in which political appointees and those elected to political office often leaned on public servants. The most famous one being the MEC for Sports, Arts and Culture in Gauteng, Faith Mazibuko, that famous recording of her asking for combi courts. But this is not an issue that, again, only arose after Mr. Ramaphosa raised his voice at the State Capture Commission. Dr. Maphela Ramphele wrote in 2006 already in Laying Ghost to Rest that there is a problem with cadre deployment because it enables corruption. Njabulo Ndebele raised similar kinds of concerns around this as early as 2006 and 2008. So, one has to ask at what point does the ANC get to be held accountable, not just within its own ranks, but by the public in South Africa. And while one may disagree with the Democratic Alliance on all sorts of issues, they have the right to play political football with this, and they have the right to take the matter to court. And because of the separation of powers, the judiciary has made a judgment. The ANC is free to appeal it, and, this will go the whole route through the judiciary in the interest of either transparency or protection of private rights and rights to privacy by private organizations like political parties.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to now bring Prof. Bheki back into the conversation because, Prof, early on you alluded to the timing of it all and, questioning heading into 2024, does it pave the way for coalitions at all? In the same breath, when we also spoke about naming specific individuals. One has to question, are the positions political appointments or are they professional appointments? If so, how will it be stopped? Who is an example of a cadre deployment at this point? And really with the pressure that political parties and groups are placing, using the courts to deal with these issues, is it going to be effective enough to fix the mammoth problem, really deal with the systemic issues that we're facing in society?
No, Lizel, you are asking very pertinent questions. I think that there is a serious problem in the manner in which our politicians behave. under normal circumstances, you have people who are classified as civil servants, and then you have people who are political appointees. If we were to take, for example, the issue of SANDF and then the issue of SAPS, these are the people who serve government regardless of the party that is governing at any given time. So under normal circumstances, then you would expect that those people are not necessarily deployed by any political party, but they are appointed on the basis of their requisite skills and knowledge in those particular areas. So in that sense, then, there is a clear distinction because they become civil servants without necessarily being attached to any political party. But then when it comes to those people who are appointed based on who is in power at that given time, those are political appointees. In that case, then normally political parties decide who they want to occupy a particular position for one reason or the other. The general trend, not only in the South African context, but generally, the trend is that there are certain strategic positions where you wouldn't want somebody from another political party to occupy that position because you expect that individual to basically translate your policy position into action. Then in those cases, people who occupy those positions are political appointees. So that is when then we need to draw a distinction. I'm not sure if our politicians do that. Then your other point about this being linked to next year's election, obviously anything that happens right now has a direct or indirect impact on what is going to happen in 2024. If you look at the trend, the voting trend from 2016 to date, you get a sense that both the DA and the ANC have their numbers dwindling or shrinking. And on the other hand, we have the EFF and the Freedom Front Plus and the IFP, their numbers are showing an upward trend. So if that trend then remains in 2024, chances are you may not find the ANC getting 50+1, which is the threshold that is required for the ANC to run the country. Neither are you going to have the DA meeting that threshold, because in fact, in the case of the DA, there is no way they can meet that threshold because they don't have a representation in all the 9 provinces. So that is a done deal that in all likelihood or in all probability, come 2024, will be forced into a coalition government, which will be a recipe for disaster for this country. Because we are not ready for coalition politics, we don't seem to understand how coalition politics works, which is why some of our politicians deemed it necessary to go to countries like Denmark to try and learn how coalitions are sustained or how are they made to operate successfully. Countries like Denmark, Germany, India, Australia, they've in fact used coalition politics for quite a long time. We are not lucky in that regard. So therefore, we are in for trouble come 2024.
Prof, in the same breath, and Angela, just as we wrap up the conversation, I'll start with you, Prof, and then Angela, you can wrap up. With winning the case now at this juncture, will it have a significant impact on the ability, let's say, of the governing party and its allies to deploy selected loyalists into civil service and other public entities? And as we flip the coin, what are the dangers and limits of the DA's High Court win to abolish cadre deployment at large?
It will depend on how the appeal goes. If the ANC succeeds, then everything falls off. But then if the ANC fails in its appeal, then it means that the DA will be encouraged to take the matter forward and then have a look at those papers. But it's not something that we are going to look at today and then we'll come up with a conclusion tomorrow, because it covers a long period of time. So it means we also need to analyze it, scrutinize it, and then try to understand the logic behind it. Only then can you be in a position to pronounce and say, this is what is happening. But it comes back to the point I mentioned earlier on. What will assist the DA is if it has empirical evidence to say, so and so was appointed through this policy, and look at what he or she has performed. Then it will assist the DA's case. There are cases, in fact, that the DA can use, but it opted not to. I think primarily it just wants to see how the policy works, how it was conceptualized, and all of that. Once it has the details, I'm assuming that their next step will then be to identify certain individuals and say, on the basis of our analysis, we feel that this policy should be declared unlawful because of ABCD. But we're still a long way from that because we now have to face this appeal first and see how the ANC performs.
All right, Angela, how would you weigh in the back of what Prof. Beggy's just echoed, just with, the policy coming to the fore, the committee itself and the proceedings at large?
So I think if the DA is able to win in the appeal that the ANC mounts and gets through the whole process, presumably they would argue that this is a victory for transparency and accountability. Should the ANC win, they will make the opposite argument that actually the private business of a private organization like the African National Congress remains private. But the question that we have to ask ourselves as citizens is, to what extent do we have the right to this information? Because if we suggest that we live in a society that should be more transparent, not only because of its history and colonialism and apartheid, of statist secrecy, but also because of what has happened over the last 15 to 20 years and the endless bureaucratic approaches to governance that the African National Congress has had since 1999. Then, of course, this cadre deployment policy and its decision should be made a matter of public record, because we should know why and how people who are appointed to run SOEs, to run entire government departments below the level of Ministry and Director General, and how cadre deployment may or may not influence the positive or negative delivery of services in municipalities, how that has affected us, and why it is that we need a new system. The Public Affairs Research Institute at the University of Witwatersrand has done some wonderful work on proposing new ways of getting past the impasse pointed out decades ago by Mampela Rampela and Najibul Ndebele. And so I think this is an important moment for South Africa's citizenry and for our politicians to learn to think about, as Professor Ngombezulu pointed out, questions of how to work together for functional coalition government, but also how to remain truthful, honest, and loyal to that constitutional guarantee to the citizens of transparency and accountability. And that's a hard ask, given that we have political parties in financial trouble, we have political parties desperate to get that 50+1, and it doesn't look as if any of them is likely to get it after 2024.
Angelo, thank you very much for your time. Prof. Beggy, thank you for your time. Angelo Fick is a political analyst, and Professor Obeki Mngomezulu is from the University of Nelson Mandela, weighing in on the back of the ANC, responding to the appeal, rather coming out to say that it will appeal the decision of the High Court in Johannesburg, which has now ordered the governing party to hand over records of its cadre deployment committee to the Democratic Alliance. Again, more questions and answers at this point. Thank you to the both of them for weighing in on that conversation. We'll see how it develops as the week unfolds, but we'll leave it there for now. Take a quick ad break and continue with more news on the other side. You're watching The Watchdog. It continues after this. Right, welcome back. The Watchdog continues. In other news, Cape Town is embarking on a 120 billion rand investment in the city's bulk infrastructure, with a particular focus on water and sanitation, including housing, energy and transport within the next coming decade. Cape Town Mayor Jordan Hill-Lewis has presented the city's inaugural infrastructure report, which he says shows exactly where the city's infrastructure is currently lacking, with projects and plans to address and increase capacity.
According to the city's projections, the metro's population is expected to increase to 5.8 million people by 2040. This represents 1.75 million more than the current number of residents. More people means more pressure on existing services, including water, sanitation, housing and energy. The city says major investment over the medium to long term is a must in order to keep up with the pace. According to the report, 19 of the city's reticulation reservoirs are currently experiencing capacity constraints. 5 water treatment plants have no surplus capacity during peak demand. And there are specific constraints at, among others, Potsdam, Zandvliet and Macassar wastewater treatment works.
This is a 10-year look. It contains 120 billion rand in planned infrastructure spending over the decade, and it goes into really fine detail with maps, with details of projects, where they're going to be, and we really hope that this shows our commitment, firstly, to be honest about our problems. We're not trying to put on a glossy report that makes it look as though we've got everything covered on infrastructure. We don't. We know that there are major infrastructure pressures in Cape Town. That's the first part. And the second part is, what are we doing about it? And not just talking about it, here's the detail, down to a project level.
The infrastructure portfolio aims to deliver 300 million litres from new water sources while tackling the wastewater and sewage works to reduce spills. Some 860 million rand is budgeted for major upgrades to the Cape Flats, Milnerton and Gordons Bay sewers.
We can't argue about the pressure. What we can do is fix the infrastructure, make sure that we're ahead of the curve, so that when people do come here, as they will, and we absolutely welcome them, that the city can cope with it.
Housing, a decades-old challenge in Cape Town, is also a priority. The city says while the future of affordable housing will not be in the free housing space, some 6,500 social housing rental units are in the pipeline across 50 land parcels. Vanessa Puna, SABC News, Cape Town.
All right, so Gundo Maswime, a civil engineer and lecturer at UCT, joins us to talk about infrastructure challenges facing the country and really weighs in on the City of Cape Town's inaugural annual city infrastructure project. Very good afternoon to you, evening rather, Gundo, and thank you for your time here on the Watchdog.
Yes, good evening, Lisa, and good evening to your listeners as well at home.
Gundo, you know, on the back of the package that Vanessa, compiled, she spoke about issues of capacity, population increase, the pressure that this is going to put on cities, infrastructure, amongst other issues. But this then also obviously brings to the fore the issue of political economy at large. And I wonder, when we begin to look at how we can start to make cities more inclusive and compete economically, how would you weigh in on what this is going to do for the city at large?
Yes, I think this comes at the back of a conference by the property developers of the Western Cape, which is a very organized group that does most of the property investments. That there were constraints in terms of bulk infrastructure, which is the main lines in terms of water, energy, sanitation, and so on. But I think what the City of Cape Town has not captured well in the report is the plans for spatial integration. Most of the development, you can see where it is, but you don't find places where there's low-cost housing coming into the inner city, except where District 6 was. There seem to be plans there. So I think from a spatial integration point of view, there will still be some gaps that need to be filled.
So you've spoken about, spatial integration, and that actually leads me to my next point, because with the announcement of this budget allocation that's set for the next decade or so, Cape Town in itself consists of two worlds, if we're going to, so to speak. And one is to question how much is going to go to areas that are less developed. We've seen cases in the likes of Nyanga, Kailicha, even Guguletu, amongst others. Let's look at that allocation of resources. What really is needed to not only address the issues of today, but also the systemic issues, perhaps that brought it all about in the first place?
Yes, there are two approaches that can be used to bridge that gap. The first approach is to take people who have been removed from the inner city or from the economic centers of Cape Town to far-flung areas like the Cape Flats, Guguletu, Nyanga, and so on, and make some space for some of them in the inner city as well, so that they can also enjoy the kind of services, access to amenities that are found in the inner city. The other option is to take some of the amenities outside to where these people are based. And the question would be, in the past 10 years or so, how much of which has happened? Have they taken people in the city, or have they taken some of the projects outside? I think their successes have been modest when you look at that. But in the inner city itself, they have done a lot of big projects. Most of them have been completed well. Of course, there are challenges here and there that are systemic in the rest of the country. But I would say that would have wanted to see more on the spatial integration, bold decisions on spatial issues. That does not come through well.
Yeah, Gundo, that is definitely a question that seems to come to the fore in that region. And I wonder, when we look at the economic logic for the existence of the towns and cities, even including the informal sector at large, does it make sense at this point, as we look at urbanization, as we look at other modes that are affecting development, so to speak? What more needs to be done so that it does not have pockets of economically stagnant areas? In the same breath, when we look at the strategy, given its location and resources, are we fully utilizing it and utilizing its capacity to ensure that there's mutual or exponential benefit at this point?
From a capacity point of view, the city of Cape Town might just have the best capacity in terms of civil engineering capacity and just engineering in general, the technical capacity. They have got all the talent that is probably needed. But over and above that, they are the city probably with the largest capital investment reserves of all the 8 metros in the country. Now, they hope that informal settlements can be eradicated. Would have come first from the city of Cape Town. But from their policies, that it looks like there's an admission that informal settlements will always be here. In fact, they've made very open and bold statements that informal settlements will continue to be a feature in the city of Cape Town. And we are talking about areas like Gugulethu and Nyanga that are far-flung, but within the city itself, you have Danone, that is very close to the heart of the city in a very developed area. And even west, there's Imizamoyetu in Hout Bay, which is right in the posh areas of Hout Bay. And you would just see that the ability to deliver services in those places is quite limited. So I think the city of Cape Town would do very well, and I think they would achieve a lot by changing the mindset and saying it is possible to eradicate informal settlements with the kind of budget they have, with the type of talent and skills they have within the city. It will require really a change of mindset.
No, absolutely, a paradigm shift of sorts. When we look at the state of South Africa to date, I wonder if you can help us contextualize what a failed state amounts to when it comes to infrastructure. Where does South Africa stand? And really, what measures are put in place to get this assessment?
South Africa has taken more than 20 projects. In fact, I have counted more than 38 interventions since 1994 to address the 3 key issues that we have in terms of infrastructure development. The first one being maintenance, the second one being closing the gap in terms of infrastructure availability for water, sanitation, so that access can be increased. And the third is to have infrastructure where development is going. So our infrastructure generally is poorly located, is under-maintained, and there is still some huge backlogs. Now, the years, I think from 2000 until about 2011, there has been some massive strides in terms of new provision of new infrastructure. Government seemed by that time to have figured out how to use grants, the consolidated municipal infrastructure grants and so on. And that seemed to have been working well. A lot of people had water during that period of time that didn't have water before. But maintenance suffered drastically. And we are starting to see that there will be catastrophic failures on some infrastructure units, especially related to water, sanitation, and so on. And I think the mayor also admitted earlier that these treatment plants that are activated sludge systems, you will hardly find one that complies with its own design parameters. It is very rare. So it looks like we will have to also look elsewhere and try other means that are not necessarily activated sludge systems. They have just seemed to be very difficult and expensive to maintain. So when you look at all of that, you can see that we are not in a good space when it comes to infrastructure. Some of the parts that we are showing there in a clarifier, in many municipalities, the clarifiers are running on technologies that have become obsolete. So if any part breaks, it might take up to 6 weeks to order a new part from overseas. They are no longer available within the country. Some of the companies have relocated during the years of the sanctions, and the parts are still in place, and they are breaking down one by one. So there are all these challenges that the country has.
Gundo, you've spoken about the issue of maintenance or the lack thereof, and also compliance, amongst many other issues. So with Cape Town launching this project, how does the city perhaps set itself strategically ahead of the rest of the country, if that is the case? In the same breath, what should other cities in South Africa be learning from this initiative?
Yes, the city of Cape Town, unlike other cities, would probably have one limiting factor, which is the administrative arrangements or the processes of getting things done. And that is informed mostly by the legislative framework that you have. The procurement systems can be very cumbersome. So that becomes the limiting factor for this city of Cape Town. When it comes to resources, that is not so much of a limiting factor. So that is the biggest advantage that they have. Then the good thing that they have done is, when I read this report, it is obvious that they have taken a framework that was developed almost around the same time that SCLUMA was promulgated. And there was an infrastructure investment framework that a template was developed, I think 3-4 years ago by COCTA. But it's interesting to see that the rest of the municipalities in the country have not been able to take that template and developed anything for themselves. That is what they can learn from the city of Cape Town, and they've done it very well. In fact, there are other municipalities like Stellenbosch, I think it's Waterkloof, and a few others in the Western Cape that have also done that. And eThekwini municipality has also developed their investment framework, which is quite advanced. So I think that is what many municipalities should be aiming to achieve as well.
So Gundo, then, as we explored the advantages that Cape Town has at this point, let's extend it to the region at large. And with, a well-functioning infrastructure, given the dynamics that are happening, what is South Africa's role going to be in the region then? How can we better position ourselves by, focusing on some of the issues that by fixing some of the issues you alluded to earlier on, so that we can also be more competitive, not only for the region or for the continent, perhaps in the geo-political sphere?
The difficult thing to say is that engineering science itself is not limited in terms of what can be achieved. So for that reason, the limiting factor in many municipalities becomes the organizational dynamics, mostly the political arrangements. I think the biggest disservice we did to our country was to follow the worldwide trend where politics seem to start to lord over everything. A few years back, like in the 80s, the things like maintenance of public infrastructure, there was no political influence in the maintenance of infrastructure. The city engineer had almost a blank check to be able to plan and implement the plans accordingly. But right now, even something simple like maintenance, which in engineering science is quite a developed concept. There seems to still be political direction on where the maintenance must be done, where it must not be done. I think that is the biggest challenge, the biggest challenge, not just in South Africa, but across the developing world mostly. But in the developed world, you will find that the people who are presiding over infrastructure, even as politicians, have got the requisite skills and qualifications to be able to make the right decisions, which South Africa could never have because we have got a limited number of engineers per size of the population. And strictly speaking, it was only after 1992 that the other races could train engineers.
Gundo, you know, with all of this said and done, obviously politics is about the battle of ideas, and this is going to motivate and guide interests at large. Hopefully this is in the best interest of the people, to adhere to the will of the people. And one really then has to make distinctions between interests, incentives that could come about, but also institutions and how they're functioning and what more really can be done to improve it. But we'll leave the conversation there. Thank you very much for weighing in on that. Gundo Masume is a civil engineer and a lecturer at UCT, chatting about the infrastructure challenges facing the country, also weighing in on the City of Cape Town's inaugural annual city infrastructure project that was announced. We'll leave that conversation there. Thank him again for his time, and take another ad break and continue with more news on the other side of the Watchdog. Right, welcome back. In other news, a case of attempted murder and common assault against a 55-year-old bus driver has been postponed. Musua Molaba appeared in the Hoopstad Magistrates Court earlier on. Molaba was arrested on Wednesday after a video clip where he's seen assaulting and strangling a 17-year-old schoolboy on the bus. This video went viral.
This is where the 55-year-old bus driver made a brief appearance after he was arrested earlier this week after a video went viral where he is seen allegedly hitting a 17-year-old boy. Then he has been charged with 2 charges, one of common assault as well as the charge of attempted murder that was later added after the viewing of that video. And the case has been postponed to next week Friday, where he will be given an opportunity to apply for a bail. But we have heard after that video went viral, it sparked a lot of interest from various organizations. We have seen earlier on organizations like ANC Women's League, the EFF, COSAS, as well as SADU made their way to the court today in support of the family, making various calls, among others calling for justice to prevail on this matter, and others saying that they don't want to see him being given bail. But we have also heard from the COSAS earlier on after that video went viral, where they made a call to the Department of Education that actually they should scrap altogether all the contracts of scholar transport. And earlier on, school children also made their way to the court, where they are protesting, showing their support to that 17-year-old boy. But with me, I am with the Provincial Secretary of COSAS, Thabiso Mabaso, who will just take us through some of the demands that they are making to the Department of Education following this matter. Thank you very much for joining us. You have made a call to the Department of Education saying that it should deal with the issue of scholar transport.
Yes, that is true. We have made a call to the Department of Basic Education here in the Free State Province to say to them we want them to cancel all scholar transport contracts in the province. As we currently speak, there are millions of rands that are being paid to the service providers of scholar transport. Some of them are paying them for cars that are not even roadworthy, that are not even fit to be carrying school learners. In regards to the case that we just attended here, we are glad that the National Prosecuting Authority has added a further charge of attempted murder upon the assault charge that was previously there. We are hopeful and we have faith in the justice system that indeed justice for the family and the child will be served. Considering the fact that this person is not a first-time offender, this person was arrested in 2002 or something, and he served a prison sentence of 2 years. When we heard this in court there to us, it further gave us, it emboldened our call to say that the Department of Basic Education should stop outsourcing this crucial service of transporting learners to to external service providers, because it's quite clear that these external service providers do not do due diligence in terms of checking the backgrounds of the people that are transporting these learners, and as such there is no way that the Department of Basic Education can claim that these learners are safe in this transport, so long as due process is not being done from their side and on the side of the service providers that they use. And that is why we are saying the Department of Basic Education in the Free State Province must call us, all of us as education stakeholders in the province. We must sit down and we must draft a scholar transport policy in the province. This will regulate scholar transport that is being provided by the department itself, and the scholar transport that is being provided by independent parties that are hired by parents themselves to transport their learners. Because even those cars themselves, most of them in fact are not roadworthy. They are not cars that should be carrying learners. We see them every day. These are Sabana school. They'll be carrying school children, young children, primary school kids in the back of the buggy, and overload for that matter. These are people who are young by age and who are playful by nature. What if one of them or few of them happen to fall outside of that buggy and they get harmed along the way? These are some of the risks that the Department of Basic Education has been for quite a long time passing a blind eye upon. And we are saying, as COSAS in the Free State, we have had enough of the Department of Basic Education turning a blind eye on the dire state of scholar transport in the province. It is time that we come together, stakeholders, and we solve this problem before we start seeing more challenges than we have already seen. As it stands, we receive these things on a weekly basis. These calls from learners who are saying we are stuck with the scholar transportation. It has collapsed along the way. We receive these calls from parents saying my child has not been going to school for a week because the scholar transport that is provided by Basic Education is not coming. But if you check, this person is being paid each and every month, even though this car is not going and fetching the learners sometimes because of the fact that they are not in good conditions. These people are being paid without any questions from the Department of Basic Education, even though these cars, they die 3 times or 2 times in 1 week. This is, to us, it says the Department of Basic Education, people in there are benefiting from these service providers of scholar transportation, because there is no way that the Department of Basic Education would spend taxpayers' money on services that are not worth money, because we believe that the current cohort of scholar transports that we have in the Free State Province, they are not at all fit to be transporting school learners. As we've said, we will be sharing some of the pictures on social media, on our social media page, just to show to the people of Free State why we are saying they must be terminated, these contracts, and the Department of Basic Education must buy its own fleet, hire its own personnel to drive these learners, personnel that will undergo training on how to deal and handle learners in the case in which a learner misbehaves.
Meanwhile, in other news, medical professionals in Kimberley in the Northern Cape say there has been an increase in heat-related cases due to the recent heat wave that hit the country. However, most of the cases are not fatal, but the World Health Organization says more than 100,000 people have died from heat waves between 1998 and 2017. Meanwhile, 8 people in the Kakamas region in the Northern Cape died after suffering from heat strokes 2 weeks ago.
Periods of excessive heat that persist for 3 days or more. A study released by the South African Medical Research Council reveals that infants, the elderly, people with disabilities, and pregnant women are most vulnerable to heat strokes. It's also believed that heat waves cause irritability, which leads to gender-based violence, among others.
We need to know how the environmental factors are affecting human health. I think it's very imperative to do those kinds of studies because create awareness and advise the government accordingly. It's an ongoing research, and it's been years, and it's different studies. It's not just one study, but at the end, we took years of research and put it together just to see what's been happening over the years.
Heat strokes come in 3 stages if it's not treated. Firstly, dehydration, then heat exhaustion, followed by a heat stroke. Precautionary measures for those outdoors need to be taken. So what exactly happens when you suffer a heat stroke? Let's have a look. Firstly, a file is opened at the hospital. After that, you are assessed. Depending on the assessment, you will either be transferred to a general unit or an emergency unit. If needs be, you will be hospitalized.
We have been seeing a lot more cases recently because of our heat stroke, because of the recent heat wave that's been happening. However, we haven't had extreme cases yet in our area. But the things that we would be looking out for is if somebody comes in and they are having a body temperature that's above 40 degrees, for example, when we measure it. People who may be presenting with neurological symptoms. So if they're coming in, they're confused.
The climate change bill before Parliament aims to develop an effective long-term climate change response.
If you look at our climate change and health adaptation plan, it's a plan that is led by the Department of Health, but you've got all other stakeholders involved, all departments, research institutions of higher learning, municipalities, provinces, and members of the organized structures of the community who are participating in these structures.
However, some say they were not consulted about the bill.
We missed the period for public participation. It wasn't advertised or nobody on the normal platforms that they use. So we couldn't participate and make them aware of these additional risks. But I've gone through it, and what I see, no, it's definitely not a good bill for us at the end of the day. It's not going to help. It's specific relation to cities and city folk.
Meanwhile, an investigation is currently underway into the deaths of 8 farm workers who died due to heat stroke in Kakamas 2 weeks ago. The Department of Labour says they need to handle the matter with sensitivity and will release a report on the findings. Reginald Witboy, SABC News, Kimberley.
All right, so let's take a look at newsmaking headlines. Globally now, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives in the United States has used its slim majority to remove Democratic Representative Ilhan Omar from her seat on the Foreign Affairs Committee over her past criticism of Israel. Now, members of both the Republican and Democratic parties had earlier criticized her previous comments as anti-Semitic, drawing an apology from Omar at the time. Now, the former refugee of Somali descent is one of only 2 Muslim women serving in the U.S. Congress. Omar received the full backing of her caucus, who slammed the Republican resolution targeting the Minnesota representative for, amongst others, describing Israel as an apartheid state. Omar has been accused of equating the United States with so-called terrorist groups like the Taliban and Hamas, as she argued for accountability and justice for the victims of crimes against humanity.
The ayes are 218, the nays are 211, with 1 answering present. The resolution is adopted.
The vote was seen as just the latest in a tit-for-tat scenario between both parties after Democrats used their majorities in the last Congress to remove GOP reps Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar for extremist social media posts, including one of a video depicting violence against a Democratic member of the House.
We have the ability and the responsibility to help combat anti-Semitism and ensure that our children, tomorrow's leaders, are taught that such rhetoric is unacceptable. Let's be clear, anti-Semitism has no place in the halls of the Congress, nor in our national conversation, and I stand here today in solidarity with the Jewish community to send a strong message that the United States House of Representatives does not tolerate such behavior. I urge my colleagues to support the resolution.
But Democrats were having none of it, labeling the resolution an attempt at political revenge while pointing to what they view as Republican hypocrisy.
Do not insult our intelligence by suggesting this is about anti-Semitism. You want to introduce a resolution against someone guilty of anti-Semitism? Introduce a resolution against someone dining with anti-Semites, someone dining with white nationalists, members of your conference who are speaking at white nationalist rallies. Introduce a resolution against Donald J. Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, and others. But do not
The gentleman's time has
insult our
expired.
intelligence by saying this is about anti-Semitism.
The gentleman's time
Vote
has
no on this
expired.
resolution.
In an emotional speech on the House floor, Omar hit back at her detractors.
I am Muslim. I am an immigrant, and interestingly, from Africa. Is anyone surprised that I am being targeted? Is anyone surprised that I am somehow deemed unworthy to speak about American foreign policy, or that they see me as a powerful voice that needs to be silenced. Frankly, it is expected, because when you push power, power pushes back. Representation matters. Continuing to expand our ideas of who is American and who can partake in the American experiment is a good thing.
Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy had long promised retribution for past votes taken by Democrats to remove members of his caucus from their committee assignments, but Omar remained defiant.
I didn't come to Congress to be silent. I came to Congress to be their voice. And my leadership and voice will not be diminished if I am not on this committee for one term. My voice will get louder and stronger, and my leadership will be celebrated around the world as it has been. So take your vote or not. I am here to stay, and I am here to be a voice against harms around the world and advocate for a better world.
Omar, first elected to the House in 2018, is the first Somali American and the first naturalized citizen of African birth to serve in the U.S. Congress. Sherwin Ricebees, SABC News, New York.
And on that note, that's all we have for you this evening. Do join us on Monday evening, same time. Of course, Wumvoko's back. But from myself, Hazel Wilson, and the rest of the Watchdog team, until then, it's good night.